One of the first questions you should be asking yourself is, what service am I providing? How is that characterized when we're looking at the relevant legal framework? Now, the context that we're talking about is payment services within the UK. We'll talk about jurisdictional nexus in a bit, but it's primarily a characterization question. What am I doing? Is it caught by the payments framework? And the reason that you're asking that question is because in part of the potential sanctions if you get that wrong. Now in the UK, those sanctions can be criminal.
So let's look at the regulated payment services. In general, these relate to services relating to payment accounts, so that could be providing a current account, executing payment transactions, so this could be your debit or credit transaction, issuing payment instruments, so that's anybody who issues a credit or debit card, acquiring services, so that would capture a firm like WorldPay, and typical open banking services, so these are third-party service providers that provide account information services and payment initiation services. So it's important to interrogate the kind of technical legal framework and identify whether or not you've triggered a licensing requirement under the payment services regulation.
Although we're talking about payment services under the payment services regulations today, actually if you're setting up a new payments business, it's important to think about some of the other licensing regimes that apply in the UK to make sure that you don't inadvertently fall into one of them. So for example, if you're issuing e-money like Revolut does, then you might need to be licensed as an e-money issuer. Or equally, if in your business you're actually accepting funds from customers, you need to make sure that you're not inadvertently accepting deposits, for which you'd need a banking license under the Financial Services and Markets Act. And finally, another sort of pitfall that you would want to avoid is around FX, and making sure that if you're doing foreign exchange as part of your business, that any FX transactions are spot transactions, to make sure they're not classified as derivatives, because again, if you're doing derivatives, you would need to get a different kind of license under the Financial Services and Markets Act. And that's something that we've seen actually can be a pitfall for firms in practice. And there was a recent FCA enforcement case on just that issue.
So the next question we're going to ask ourselves is the jurisdictional scope. So we've just been talking about the list of payment services. And the next things we'd be looking, well, where is the provider, where is the recipient? And there is some FCA guidance on this which is quite helpful in respect of cross-border provision into the UK. But the test here is going to be, is the regular occupational business of the provider the relevant payment service in the UK? So if we've hit all the other parts of the test, so we've got a payment service, we're within the jurisdiction, well, we're going to start thinking about exemptions. So for example, are you a technology services provider? Is this a service that's provided between payment service providers for their own account? Or is it an intra-group services arrangement? So all of those potentially are going to be within the scope of exemptions and therefore not trigger licensing.
If you have concluded that you need to be licensed, then what do you need to think about? Well, firstly, you'll need to think about authorization. And in order to do that, you'll need to think about your legal form. So will you be setting up a branch or a subsidiary? You'll need to think about the capital requirements and the insurance coverage requirements. You'll also need to consider the safeguarding rules, and we've discussed this in further detail in our separate sessions. There are also rules in relation to disclosing information to customers. In particular, there are rules about the terms that need to go into your customer contracts. It's possible to opt out of this for certain types of consumers or customers, in particular corporate customers. And there are also the financial promotions regime. So firms must communicate with their customers in a way which is clear, fair, and not misleading. In addition, there are operational requirements. So these are rules in relation to transaction timeframes. It could be about charging rules, authentication, fraud reporting, cybersecurity. There are a whole host of operational requirements to think about. And if that were not enough, The firm will also have to think about what other rules it will need to comply with as a regulated business. So in particular, there's the KYC and AML rules, and also the wire transfer regulations.
When we're advising clients on payment services business, there are a few key resources that we would typically go to in addition to the regulations themselves. And these include the FCA's Perimeter Guidance Manual in its handbook. And that's really useful because it sets out examples and guidance of which kinds of activities the FCA considers fall within the regulated scope of payment services, or even other regulated activities, and which ones don't. Then there's the FCA's approach document to the payment services regulations. And what that does is it goes through in a lot of practical detail how the FCA expects firms to comply with the rules that apply to payment institutions in practice. In addition to sort of giving you guidance around that, the FCA also signposts a number of the other kinds of rules that apply to payment institutions as regulated businesses. And that's useful because often actually it can be quite difficult to navigate which of those rules do or do not apply. In addition, if you're looking at strong customer authentication or open banking type requirements, the European Banking Authority has published a lot of really useful question and answers. It's also published various opinions setting out how it expects firms to comply with some of the technical standards set out in the regulations themselves. And it's worth noting actually that those EBA materials are still relevant in the UK even after the end of the Brexit transition period.